Senator Leo Husako. Senator, welcome again. How are you?
I'm well, thank you very much.
So, your views on Bill C-10. Artists seem to love it. The Quebec National Assembly seems to love it. What do they love so much about it?
Quite frankly, I don't think there's that much unanimity, even amongst Canadian artists. I don't think. Look, the problem with this bill fundamentally is it's the largest grab when it comes to freedom of speech in this country that we have ever seen. We have a government that is completely committed to having a bunch of bureaucrats who are politically appointed by the government to make decisions on what we post, what we read, what we watch. Canadians are slowly waking up to this draconian measure, which is really very dangerous. We all agree at the beginning of the process it was designed to create legislation in order to create and rectify some of the inequity in dealing with some of the new media platforms that are out there, social media platforms like Twitter and YouTube and
Netflix.
And Disney Plus and all the things that, of course, have become part and parcel of our lifestyle, right? Who doesn't today use all these outlets to garner information, to put out information, to follow the news, to follow entertainment, and it has shaped the way broadcasting is done. And of course, the Broadcasting Act is very archaic in this country, and it needs to address some of these inequities. But that's what the process was at the beginning of this legislation. And all of a sudden, ever since the three-headed monsters of the House of Commons have jumped into this, they've politicized this piece of legislation. And when I say the three-headed monsters, the Bloc Québécois, the NDP, and the Liberals, who are just trying to score cheap political points. And really, this legislation has degenerated into something other than what its original intention was. So I'm not even so sure that the movie production industry in Canada, artists in Canada, fully appreciate the risks involved with this, because artists today also include young people. So today's young artists, they use stuff like YouTube and Twitter and a lot of these platforms that an old guy like me is not familiar with as springboards to launch their career, to express their artistic form, the Canadian content that everything government does in the CRTC is to protect Canadian content. Well, today's artists in Canada want to expose themselves to the world. They want to expose, and these platforms give them that opportunity.
Okay, we'll take a timeout, Senator. Stay with us. We'll come back and we'll find out whether this piece of legislation, if given royal assent ultimately, could be used to put down political opposition. Anything that the government deems unsafe, in their words, or unsavory. Senator Leo Husako stays with us. We'll also talk about Ian Stewart, the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada, recently admonished by the House of Commons. Back with more in a moment. Stay with us.
Just having a little chin wag on the Richard Syrett Show. News Talk, Saga 960 AM.
Conservative Senator Leo Husako stays with us. We're talking about Bill C-10. So the Heritage Minister, keeps reiterating that this is about going after platforms and not people. But then, of course, the Liberals refuse to reinstate that exemption that would protect individual online content. So this is now before the Senate. It's up to you guys to hold this thing up. But as Tom Korski from Blacklock's Reporter reminded us earlier, the Senate hasn't voted down a piece of government legislation in a quarter century. So what can the Senate do at this point?
Well, the Senate can do a lot. But back to your original question, obviously our concern is about shutting down voices in this country. And anytime a group of bureaucrats, as I said in my initial comments, is empowered with legislation to determine what's correct and what isn't correct, it, of course, leads us into a slippery slope. And it's about also giving consumers in this country more choice, Richard. At the end of the day, connectivity in Canada is probably one of the highest in terms of price than most countries in the world, certainly G7 countries. And that's because Canadians don't have choice. And another big danger with C10, this is another example of government and bureaucracy wanting to limit choice for Canadians. Now, what can the Senate do? You're absolutely right. This independent Senate of Justin Trudeau has more often than not kowtowed to the government and has passed their legislation with very little opposition. I'm happy to see in the last few days there's a large number, there's momentum building among senators from various groups that find this legislation completely egregious in terms of content, and they're also very disappointed with the process that the government has used to try to steamroll it through the House of Commons.
All right. Is your aim perhaps just to hold it up long enough until a federal election? Is that part of the game plan?
Look, as a legislator, I believe my aim, and it's very transparent, and I will speak to this in the earliest opportunity, is to take this bill, look at it carefully, review it carefully. That is the role of the Senate. If there's ever a role, it's for legislation like this. And I want to make sure that all the stakeholders that did not participate in this process, there's a lot of stakeholders who bypassed their opportunity to go speak before the House of Commons committee because they thought the legislation was going to be heading towards a particular direction. And by the end of the process, they hadn't had an opportunity to do so because we saw that this bill morphed into something else in secrecy. The government and the NDP and the Liberals, they sat in a dark corner and they negotiated elements of this legislation, of course, outside of the procedural rules of the House of Commons. And thank God some of those irregularities were called out by the Speaker. Now, we as a Senate, we have an obligation to try to depoliticize it, look at this legislation, bring in every single stakeholder in this country that wants to express themselves on this legislation. And I've already put the government on standby that, listen, we're not going to rubber stamp this in the next 48 hours. It will not become the law of the land. If it takes 6 months to look at it carefully, 9 months, 12 months, whatever it takes to make sure that this piece of legislation is what Canadians want.
Are you surprised, disappointed that the mainstream media or the Fourth Estate, particularly the print media, really doesn't seem all that interested in Bill C-10, at least not in criticizing it? Other than independent news organizations, True North, Blacklock's Reporter, they've been all over this from the beginning. Why is it that the national media doesn't really seem that interested in Bill C-10?
That's a good question. I've been reflecting on that, and the only logical explanation that I can come up with, there's the us versus them line that's being drawn in the sand in the broadcasting business. There's those that have been in the traditional platforms that are afraid of the new competition that's coming onto the scene. So instead of everyone participating in a way where we can try to find the way to maximize all the various platforms that are coming out and utilizing them in a beneficial way, everyone, I think, is trying to protect their territory without clearly understanding what really that territory is. Do you worry that the Liberal government would use Bill C-10, if it is enacted into law, to suppress political dissent in this country? Richard, I've been an activist in politics for 38 years. I've been now sitting in the upper chamber of Parliament for more than a decade. Every politician has the best of intentions. But regardless of political stripes, we've seen time and time again that every political party and every political leader, when they're sitting in opposition, they are all for freedom of expression, freedom of association. They rip their shirt in indignation whenever anybody tries to infringe upon the parliamentary rights and procedures. But as soon as they get into government, they slip into that zone where they say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, we as legislators and as Canadians, we have to make sure that when we make laws, there is no crack. There is no inkling of an opportunity of somebody who wants to do something egregious or wants to do something unacceptable has the legal opportunity to do so.
All right, we'll take another time out, come back and discuss the president of the Public Health Agency of Canada being admonished in the House yesterday. What does that mean? Does that carry any weight? This has to do with the request by the House of Commons on 3 separate occasions for unredacted documents relating to the investigation into the Chinese scientists at the the virology lab, Canada's top virology lab in Winnipeg. Back with more of the Richard Syrett Show right after this.
Let's rejoin the conversation on the Richard Syrett Show on News Talk, Saga 960 AM.
Conservative Senator Leo Husako stays with us. We appreciate your time, Senator. Who is Ian Stewart? I mean, I know he's president of the Public Health Agency of Canada, but I'm guessing that most Canadians, myself included, are not even aware of this position and what this title entails. Who is he?
Well, he's the one that runs the public health system in this country, and he's the one that is in charge of the various organizations, including our lab, our very respected high-level research lab, virological lab in Winnipeg. He's the one where the buck stops when it comes to our national healthcare strategy.
So he was called before the House, or to the House, on Monday to be admonished, to be formally admonished, because 3 times the House of Commons, and this is a kind of a rare instance of unity in the opposition parties, all demanded that these unredacted documents pertaining to this investigation at the bio lab in Winnipeg, going back to July 2019, when 2 Chinese scientists were kicked out. They posed a national security risk, and each time the president of the Public Health Agency has refused to produce these documents. Now, he was supposed to bring them with him on Monday, and still he refused. So what is the point of this admonishing? What actually occurs when you're admonished?
Look, the authority of Parliament is great. They can exercise whatever authority they want. They can subpoena Canadian citizens. They can subpoena bureaucrats, directors of organizations. But at the end of the day, the more serious problem we're facing, all this is for naught when the executive branch of government shows nothing but contempt towards the House of Commons. And when we say the House of Commons, we're talking about the democratic body. I remind people in this country that the executive branch gets elected during a general election. But it's Parliament and the Westminster system whose role it is for those representatives to be the voice of democracy over the period of time that Parliament is functioning. So when the House of Commons in the last few years passes a motion calling on the government to list the IRGC, the Iranian terrorist regime, as terrorists, and 3 years later the Trudeau government refuses to do so, when the Parliament of Canada, with members from all political parties, including elected Liberals, the majority of elected Liberals, pass a motion, recognize what China is doing to Uyghurs in China as a genocide, and the executive Trudeau government refuses to heed that overwhelming call from Parliament. When Parliament calls on the Trudeau government to come clean and explain what the umpteen numbers of redacted documents regarding the WE scandal, and they refuse to do so, and they go to the point of proroguing Parliament, which is shutting Parliament down. It just shows the degree of contempt that Justin Trudeau has for Parliament. So right now, this gentleman, of course, he's facing the wrath of Parliament, but he's facing that wrath because, for reasons difficult for me to understand, Mr. Trudeau and his government refuse to be forthwith with the information, which is serious. There are 2 scientists who had the highest security clearance in that Winnipeg lab that were involved in research regarding COVID and other sensitive matters, who were, what it seems, caught spying on behalf of China. And Parliament wants to have the full details, as do Canadians want to know what was compromised. How could 2 individuals like that receive the highest security clearance? These are legitimate questions. And Mr. Trudeau, again, continues to be showing nothing but contempt for the Parliament and essentially the Canadian people, through this.
So if Ian Stewart, the president of the Public Health Agency Canada, is refusing to produce these documents, can we say that he is doing so on cabinet order?
For sure, as we've seen, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet continue to refuse providing those documents. And that's why Parliament was compelled to call upon him to provide the information. So I sympathize with this individual because, of course, directors of large agencies, federal agencies, ultimately report to Cabinet. And Cabinet is the one who's accountable to Parliament.
So what is their argument that by making these documents or presenting these documents to the House of Commons, that they would be putting national security at risk after they've risked national security by allowing these Chinese scientists access to our top lab?
Obscene, isn't it? And absurd. At the end of the day, it's the same government that ever since we've had two Canadian citizens illegally detained, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, we have a government that continues to dialogue with China. We have a government that continues to invest in the Asia Infrastructure Bank. We have a government that China continues to trample all over the democracy activist movement in Hong Kong. And Mr. Trudeau continues to kowtow to China and continues to dialogue with them. We have the Chinese ambassador threatening parliamentarians and blacklisting parliamentarians like Michael Chong because he stands up for human rights and democracy and freedom around the world. And there are prominent elite liberals that sign a public letter calling on the government to engage in hostage trading, imagine, in order to break this impasse, as they say. So I'm very worried what it is exactly that the Chinese regime has on Prime Minister Trudeau, because it's been now 3 years. We're still waiting for a decision on Huawei and their implication on 5G. And the list goes on. And CSIS has been very public about the fact that China has infiltrated, in terms of intellectual security, many private and public sector areas in our country. And recently we've seen politicians, both in the House of Commons and even in my own chamber in the Senate, who stand up and have become apologists, literally using talking points that Beijing uses to justify the inexcusable.
So, what's left at that? I mean, this is a privilege of the House of Commons, is to demand these documents, and it is being ignored. Do they have the weight of law behind them? What else can they do?
Well, they do. And I guess right now the opposition parties are going to have to use all their tools at their disposal. The problem is very often also politics takes over, and we see from time to time the opposition parties don't stay united in holding the Liberals to account. We've seen the NDP and the Bloc Québécois make side deals and back deals in order to promote their personal agendas, allowing the Liberals flexibility to get away with behavior that's completely abhorrent. Particularly, they let them off the hook in a minority parliament when that shouldn't be the case. At the end of the day, I've never seen in my 38 years of involvement in politics as an activist and as a senator, a government that does not have any sense of accountability towards Parliament. Richard, you seem to be muted.
Oh, thank you. There's the guest telling the host how to do his job, and rightly so. Rightly so, sir. Thank you. I appreciate your time. I did have my mic muted. Thank you for that. My producer was frantically trying to get a hold of me. All right. You're always very generous with your time, sir, and we appreciate it. And I hope you'll join me again.
Anytime. Thank you so much, Richard.
All right.